I'm from New Hampshire. Back in my early 20s, I lived about 30 minutes outside of Manchester. At the time, I was recovering from a 2-year relationship that had ended just a few weeks earlier. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, but it left me feeling adrift, like a ship that had lost its anchor. My grandmother, a devoutly religious woman, became my rock during this time. She'd been going to church every Sunday for as long as I could remember, and after my grandfather's passing, her faith seemed even more unshakable. She often spoke about how she knew he was at peace, reunited with the Lord, and while I didn't share her beliefs, I admired her conviction. It gave her comfort, and in a way it comforted me too. To support her, and maybe to find some stability myself, I started accompanying her to Sunday services. Our church was a small, close-knit community, the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name. It was rare to see a new face, which is why I was immediately intrigued when I noticed her. She was sitting near the back, her dark curls catching the sunlight that streamed through the stained glass windows. Her hazel eyes had an intensity that seemed to pull you in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't quite belong. After the service ended, I worked up the nerve to approach her. "Hi, I'm Nathan," I said, trying to sound casual. She smiled, a small, enigmatic curve of her lips. "Emily," she replied. There was something about her that immediately captivated me. We started talking and the connection was instant. It wasn't just attraction, it was curiosity. She had this quiet, mysterious charm, and the more she spoke, the more I wanted to know. I asked her about her family, her life, but she deflected most of my questions with playful banter. "You'll have to take me out for those answers," she said with a teasing grin. Eventually, she admitted that her family had recently moved to the area and that she was attending a nearby college. That explained why I'd never seen her before. By the time we parted ways, I'd managed to get her number. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of excitement. Getting to know her. Over the next week, Emily and I texted constantly. She was witty, engaging, and just mysterious enough to keep me hooked. When I added her on Instagram, I noticed her profile was sparse, only a handful of posts and very few followers. I didn't mind. In fact, I found it refreshing. As we talked more, she began to open up about her past. Her stepfather, she confided, was an abusive alcoholic. Her biological father was even worse, though she refused to go into detail. She told me her family had moved to escape him, leaving behind everything and everyone they'd ever known. Her vulnerability drew me in even more. I admired her resilience, her ability to smile and laugh despite the pain she carried. By the time Sunday rolled around, I couldn't wait to see her again. She was at church that Sunday, sitting in the same pew. After the service, I asked her out, and to my relief, she said yes. We made plans to meet later that week, and I spent the days leading up to our date feeling equal parts nervous and excited. When the night finally came, we kept it simple: a movie and dinner. Emily was just as engaging in person as she had been over text. She was a great listener, and she seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. After dinner, I suggested we go for a drive. I wanted to extend the night, to spend a little more time getting to know her. We hit the highway, driving out of town. The road was quiet, flanked by tall trees on either side. The evening air was cool, and everything felt perfect. But that perfection was short-lived. Out of nowhere, Emily began speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Her words were rapid, almost frantic, and her voice had taken on a strange, hollow tone. At first, I thought she was joking, but then I looked at her. Her eyes had rolled back, leaving only the whites visible. Her body trembled, and her head tilted back unnaturally. Panic set in. I swerved the car, narrowly avoiding the barrier, and pulled over to the shoulder. "Emily," I said, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. Her head vibrated slightly, and she continued mumbling in that foreign tongue. My heart was racing. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. "I think she's having a seizure," I told the operator. As I waited for help to arrive, I kept glancing at her, unsure of what to do. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Her head snapped forward and her eyes returned to normal. She turned to me, her hazel eyes wide and wild, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Then she bolted. Before I could react, Emily threw open the car door and sprinted into the woods. I called after her, but she didn't stop. Her movements were unnaturally fast, almost inhuman. I sat there, frozen in shock, before finally getting out of the car to follow her. But the woods were dark, and she was gone. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They searched the area but found no trace of her. I gave them her name and described her appearance. But when they looked her up, there was nothing. No records, no social media. It was as if she'd never existed. I tried to find her in the days that followed. I went back to the church, hoping she'd show up, but she never did. Her Instagram was gone and her number was disconnected. I even asked around at the college she said she attended, but no one had ever heard of her. To this day, I don't know what happened. Was it some kind of elaborate prank? A case of mistaken identity? Or something far stranger? I've replayed that night over and over in my mind, searching for answers, but I've found none. Has anyone ever told you about their dreams? Perhaps their past lives will help us understand a similar event? All I know is that I'll never forget her. Emily, the girl who appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as suddenly. The memory of her hazel eyes, wide with something I still can't understand, will haunt me forever. Story 2. The Desert Encounter. My family owns this old beat-up 2012 Volvo that seems to defy all logic. Despite being on its last legs, it refuses to quit. It's the kind of car that feels like it's held together by duct tape and sheer stubbornness. The thing has a laundry list of problems. Brakes that feel soft, a temperamental engine, and half the electronics barely work. But it still runs, somehow. My parents have been waiting for it to break down completely so they'd have an excuse to get a new car. Until then, I'm the one stuck driving it. One of its many issues is that the windshield wipers don't work at all. Driving in the rain is practically a death sentence. Even a light drizzle turns the windshield into a blurry mess. But we live in Nevada, the driest state in the country, so rain typically isn't a concern. At least, that's what I told myself before one unforgettable summer night. This happened a couple of years ago during the summer. I was on my way back from visiting my old friend Calvin, who lived a few states over. Calvin and I hadn't seen each other in years, so I decided to make the trip a little adventure. I've always loved long drives, especially the kind that take you through stretches of empty desert. There's something calming about being alone on the road, surrounded by vast open landscape. The drive there was fantastic. The Volvo somehow managed the entire trip without a single hiccup. I stayed at Calvin's place for a few nights, and we spent the time catching up, drinking, and reminiscing about old times. It was exactly what I needed. By the time I started the journey back, I was in high spirits. The majority of the drive was smooth sailing, just me, the road, and the endless desert. But as I crossed back into Nevada, the weather took a turn. At first, it was just a light drizzle, nothing too concerning, but within minutes, the rain intensified. It wasn't just heavy, it was a full-blown thunderstorm, complete with flashes of lightning and torrential downpours. The kind of rain that makes you question every decision that led you to that moment. I later learned it was one of the heaviest rainfalls Nevada had seen in years. At the time, though, all I could think about was how my useless windshield wipers were going to get me killed. The rain completely obscured my view, forcing me to pull over. I veered off the highway and parked a considerable distance into the desert. I didn't want to risk a truck or another car slamming into me. My plan was simple: wait out the storm, maybe try to get some sleep in the car. Calling for help wasn't an option. Money was tight, and I couldn't afford a ticket or a tow. Plus, the thought of asking my 65-year-old parents to drive 3.5 hours to rescue me was out of the question. I was on my own, stuck in the middle of the desert during a thunderstorm. Not a single car passed me for over an hour. The storm showed no signs of letting up. At some point, the isolation started to get to me. The desert has a strange way of playing tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone. I couldn't shake this unsettling feeling, like I was being watched. I kept glancing out the car's windows, half expecting to see something, or someone lurking in the darkness. But all I saw were miles of rocks and sand. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert. The thought of spending the night out there sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard enough stories about strange desert encounters to know that caution was warranted. As if to mock me, the storm began to subside just as twilight settled in. The rain lessened to a steady drizzle, and the lightning grew more distant. I thought maybe I'd finally be able to get back on the road. But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the unease in my chest only grew stronger. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the distant lightning. Its flashes lit up the horizon, illuminating the desert in brief, eerie bursts. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually I decided to try and get some sleep. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I noticed something strange. Flashes of light in the distance. At first I thought it was more lightning, but these lights were different. They were sharp, bright bursts, darting through the darkness in erratic patterns. They seemed to jump around, almost like they were coming from multiple sources. I watched in confusion, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then it hit me. They were getting closer. Panic set in. The lights weren't just moving toward me, they were moving fast. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out of the car. I didn't know why, but every instinct screamed that I needed to hide. I grabbed my phone and scrambled out of the car, running toward a nearby rock formation. The rain soaked through my clothes as I crouched behind the rocks, trying to steady my breathing. Peeking around the edge, I kept my eyes on the car. That's when I saw them. 3 figures, each holding a flashlight, moving through the darkness toward my car. Their beams flailed wildly, illuminating the desert in chaotic bursts. There was something off about the way they moved, like they were stumbling or dancing. I found myself watching as they proceeded toward my car. They reached my car and began circling it, shining their flashlights through the windows. It was as if they were searching for something. Or someone. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. Suddenly, one of them fired a gunshot into the air. The sound shattered the silence, making me jump so hard I nearly lost my balance. I bit down on my lip to keep from making any noise. The taste of blood filled my mouth as I pressed myself closer to the rock. For what felt like an eternity, I stayed frozen, listening to the rain and the occasional crack of thunder. When I finally dared to look again, the flashlights were gone. The figures had vanished. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Just as I was beginning to think they'd left, the lights reappeared. This time they were closer. The beams danced around my car, almost tauntingly. I knew I couldn't stay hidden all night. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Whispering as quietly as I could, I explained what was happening. The operator assured me that help was on the way. I huddled behind the rocks, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Every second felt like an hour. Finally, I saw the faint glow of police lights in the distance. The moment the flashing red and blue lights appeared, the figures bolted. They disappeared into the darkness as quickly as they'd come. By the time the officer reached my car, they were long gone. This had become a haunted part of my experience at the police canton. I ran toward the police car, waving my arms like a madman. The officer listened patiently as I recounted everything. He didn't seem surprised, which somehow made it worse. He waited with me until the storm passed, but there wasn't much else he could do. To this day, I don't know who those figures were or what they wanted. I haven't taken a road trip since, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of that night, the lights, the figures, the gunshot, is something I'll carry with me forever. Story 3: The Unforgettable Road Trip. What I'm about to share with you is the strangest experience of my life. My name is Mary, and this happened a few months ago during a road trip from Florida to New Jersey with my friend Carol. The trip started out as a fun adventure. We had just spent a week visiting friends who were in school down in Florida. But eventually, it was time to head home and get back to our lives. Analyzed, we had everything planned: snacks, music, and hours of catching up. It was supposed to be the kind of road trip you look back on fondly, a time capsule of laughs and shared memories. Looking back, I wish we had stayed one more night at our friend's place, but I was eager to get home, and we decided to do the whole drive in one shot. We drove through the night and into the early morning hours. The roads were quiet, the kind of stillness that feels almost comforting when you're driving long distances. A few hours after sunrise, I started to feel stiff from sitting for so long. My back ached, and I could tell Carol was getting restless too. "Let's pull over somewhere," I suggested. "Get some gas, stretch our legs, maybe grab something to eat." Carol agreed, and we started looking for an exit. After passing a few, we finally saw signs for what seemed to be a touristy little town. The signs promised lively attractions, unique shops, and local history. It sounded perfect. As we pulled into the town, something felt off. The streets were eerily empty, and the buildings looked like they'd seen better days. The paint was faded, the windows smudged, and there wasn't a single person in sight. It wasn't abandoned, not entirely, but it had that unsettling aura of a place that had been forgotten. It's hard to explain, but the moment we entered, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, but an overwhelming sense that we didn't belong there. "This place is weird," I muttered to Carol as we drove deeper into the town. "Maybe it's just early," she said, trying to stay optimistic. But even she couldn't hide the unease in her voice. Our first stop was a convenience store. We needed gas, and I figured we could grab some snacks while we were there. The parking lot was empty, and the inside was quiet. Too quiet. The store looked normal enough at first glance. The shelves were stocked, and faint music played over the speakers. Carol went off in search of her favorite drink, but after a few minutes, she came back empty-handed, grumbling about how they didn't have it. "Let's just go somewhere else," she said, clearly annoyed. I still wanted my Gatorade, though, so I walked up to the counter to pay. The cashier was a woman in her early 30s with dark brown hair and suspenders. She seemed completely normal, but something about her stuck in my mind. Maybe it was the suspenders. They weren't something you saw every day. "Return for?" After paying, we left and spotted another convenience store across the street. Hoping Carol could find what she wanted there, we decided to give it a shot. The moment we walked into the second store, my stomach dropped. Standing behind the counter was the exact same woman from the first store. Same dark hair, same height, same suspenders. It was like she had teleported across the street. I froze, staring at her. She noticed and gave me a wary look. "Do you have a twin?" I blurted out, my voice shaking. She frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "No, I'm an only child." Her response sent a chill down my spine. I tried to explain myself, stammering about how I thought I'd seen her before, but she didn't say anything else. She just stood there, watching me with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. I backed out of the store, dragging Carol with me. Outside, I explained what I'd seen. but Carol brushed it off. "You're probably just tired," she said. "Long drives mess with your head." I knew what I saw, though. Determined to prove it, I convinced Carol to go back to the first store with me. But when we got there, the cashier was completely different. She was shorter, with light hair, and looked to be in her 40s. There was no way she was the same person. Carol insisted we let it go, but I couldn't shake the unease. We still needed gas, so we pulled into a nearby station. The place was deserted, not a single car at the pumps, no one in sight. We parked and walked inside. Carol wandered off again, still searching for her elusive drink while I paid for the gas. We weren't inside for more than a couple of minutes, but when we stepped back outside, everything had changed. The once empty gas station was now packed with cars. Every pump was occupied, and there were even vehicles lined up, waiting their turn. The parking lot, which had been empty moments ago, was now full, and the people, they were all staring at us. I've never felt such intense discomfort. Their eyes followed us as we walked back to the car, unblinking and cold. Nietzsche looked around the executive bunker completely empty. Nietzsche joked, "What the hell is going on?" Carol whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my own panic in check. "Let's just get out of here." We didn't stop for food. Neither of us had an appetite anymore. We got back on the road, desperate to leave that strange town behind. For a while, we drove in silence, the tension in the car almost suffocating. Carefully, she said, "Traveling alone can be a terrific sport, especially if grief exists." As we talked about what had happened, a car passed us. It was a Toyota Sienna with a cracked windshield. The crack was massive, a spiderweb that stretched across the glass. Carol made a joke about it, trying to lighten the mood. But neither of us was really in the mood to laugh. About 10 minutes later, the same minivan passed us again. Same crack, same scratches on the side. It was impossible. We had been driving in a straight line at a steady speed. There was no way it could have gotten ahead of us. "Oh my God," Carol whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's the same car." I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I know." She told me to speed up, and I didn't argue. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't let myself panic. Not while I was driving. I glanced at the GPS, hoping to distract myself, but what I saw made my stomach churn. An hour had somehow passed since we left the gas station. That was impossible. We'd only been driving for about 20 minutes. We slowly fell into a state of sleep. I didn't tell Carol. She was already on the verge of a breakdown, and I didn't want to push her over the edge. Instead, I focused on getting us back to the highway. When we finally merged onto the main road, I felt a wave of relief. It was like waking up from a nightmare. By the time we got home, the whole experience felt distant, like something out of a dream. I still think about that town sometimes. About the cashiers, the gas station, the minivan. None of it makes sense. I've tried researching similar stories online, and while I've found a few that sound familiar, I've never found any real answers. The strangest part was the feeling in my gut, that overwhelming sense that something was wrong, that we were somewhere we didn't belong. I hope I never feel that way again.